Hey guys, we're just going to do a screencast today instead of looking at me. We're going to look at the 1950s, at culture and society during the 1950s. This is going to be short, but there will be a few videos, so it'll make it a little bit longer than 30 minutes. If it does go longer than 30 minutes, feel free to go ahead and break it up into a couple of days. And also make sure that you're watching the full thing, okay? I don't want you to just watch a few minutes of it and then wander off. When we think about the 1950s, I think a lot of us think about some of the iconic images of the 1950s, Elvis, Marilyn Monroe, James Dean, things of that nature. I also think that a lot of us think of a very conservative time period in American history when you have a lot of conformity and a lot of consensus. And I think what we're trying to do here as we go through is to discuss whether or not that's true or not. So we're going to move on into the 1950s and look at what many people call a golden age, and we're going to decide whether or not the 1950s was truly a golden age or not. When we think about the 1950s and early 1960s, we want to analyze the extent to which post-World War II America was an era of conformity. I think that's one of the areas that the College Board likes to question you. I know you're not going to be answering questions on this, but that's always one that they come back to. A lot of historical narratives come back to this. Was this an era of conformity? There was an element of conformity throughout the 1950s. So conformity comes typically from anxiety. Why do people conform in certain ways? They do it because they're anxious about the world they live in. They're anxious about changes in the world that they're living in. And so let's talk a little about where the anxiety is coming from. I think the biggest, when you talk about anxiety in the 1940s into the 1950s and early 1960s, really we're talking about anxiety that's coming from a changing world. And the changing world is because of two things. The first one is the atomic bomb, and the second one is the rise of communism and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. So let's really talk about those two things. Now, we can understand how much anxiety they have by just watching some of their videos from the period. So let's watch this first one, and then we'll watch the second one.
They all will try to remember who, if the atom bomb explodes right then. The bomb, cover. Here's Tony going to his house up. Tony knows the bomb can explode any year, day or night. That's the cover. Boy, Tony, black means panic. Some days, all days, they can be
We're going to be talking about nuclear energy and the kinds of things that happen in atomic emergency. And we do this not worry. But you've got to admit we live in an atomic age. There is an atomic bomb. So we have to be aware of this and know what to do in case an emergency happens.
If there will be a need to spend 2 weeks in a fallout shelter, we have packed our survival kit. For the food supply, pack a variety of fruits, soups, evaporated milk, vegetables, napkins.
News about the Soviet takeover in the West would be.
The purpose of our demonstration today is to show you the actual preparation of one of the meals which was prepared in a modern-day cave. One new meal consisted of the following foods: canned chicken,
As part of the education program, people will come and liquids.
Irish potatoes,
You'll find the
tomato
organized
juice,
Arrest all energy. No, there's out there we none.
Happens to be a party in the ribbon. It's enough atmosphere about any house. For decades, and always produce a supply.
The American has a program developed to teach
my posters on the fences against fallout. If you're caught outside during a nuclear explosion, decontamination may be necessary. You may have to burn or bury all your clothes and food, and afterwards you should wash thoroughly.
John, let me interrupt you here just a moment. I have some film here that I think will describe what might happen.
Good.
And we'll describe a little about the atom. So, Joey, why don't you catch the lights and we'll try it. Okay?
There was a turtle by the name of Bert, and Bert the turtle was very alert. When danger threatened him, he never got hurt. He knew just what to do. He ducked and cover, ducked and cover.
Now, you and I don't have shells to crawl into like Bert the turtle, so we have to cover up in our own way. Paul and Patty know this. No matter where they go or what they do, they always try to remember what to do if the atom bomb explodes right then. It's a bomb. Duck and cover. Here's Tony going to his Cub Scout meeting. Tony knows the bomb can explode any time of the year, day or night. Duck and cover. Atta boy, Tony. That flash means act fast. Sundays, holidays, vacation time, we must be ready every day, all the time, to do the right thing if the atomic bomb explodes. Duck and cover. That's the first thing to do. Duck and cover. First, you duck. And then, you cover. You duck and cover tight. Duck and cover under the table. It's a bomb. Duck and cover. 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 Duck and cover yourself.
All right. So I think you can understand, you can see the level of anxiety that the atomic bomb is creating here. Now we can laugh at it a little bit, but you understand that atomic weaponry and atomic power were brand new in the 1940s and 50s. And so it made sense for people to become more and more concerned and anxious, especially as the Cold War grew hotter and colder at different times. And whenever atomic holocaust or atomic nuclear winter actually seemed like a possibility. I think we probably really connect with that now. I think there's a lot of anxiety in the world, especially now that we're in quarantine because of COVID-19, that you can understand why there might be this anxiety because of a changing world. The other thing that really caused a lot of anxiety was the rise of the Soviet Union as a superpower in competition with the United States.
Fear of the time. A newsreel dramatized what a Soviet takeover in the Midwest would be like.
Main Street, USA, at peace, unaware that a cabal of conspirators plots its enslavement. The populace is ordered to attend to hear the dictates of their new masters.
The official name of the government established by the revolution shall be known as the United Soviet States of America, USSA.
Without a controlled press, red tyranny could not survive, so the town's newspaper editor, who is likely to be independent, is quickly seized to adorn a concentration camp.
As part of an Americanism education program, the people of Mosinee, Wisconsin played the roles of communists and their victims.
Russian army came into the schools, burned school books there in a bonfire.
Bill Swinler organized the putsch at the school.
They arrested all of the clergy in the community, Catholic priest, the Lutheran minister, Methodist minister, the mayor, the chief of police, dad. There was a crowd in there, really, nuns, the whole works.
What happens to the economy in the red heavens is enough to plant despair in the heart of any housewife. But the generous dictators can always produce a soup line.
The Americanism program was developed to teach pride in being an American. Because of this day that we had, the kids that went to school got an education that couldn't come out of a book. It was an education where we saw firsthand that we had it pretty good as Americans.
It can't happen here. Well, this is what it looks like if it should.
Popular fears about Soviet war.
So you can imagine the anxiety that would come out of that, the Americanism program there in schools, giving kids an understanding of why the United States free market system is so much better. So anxiety is fairly high in the 1940s going into the 1950s, and this is going to create a desire for a level of conformity. And you can see that anxiety kind of come to fruition in the government and in social spaces with the Red Scare. You have our second Red Scare. For those of you who don't remember, the first Red Scare was in 1919 with what were called the Palmer Raids, as the Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer went after communist and socialist organizers of labor unions and deported many people out of the United States. And this led us to our first quota system for immigration to try to reduce the number of immigrants. Now, the second Red Scare is going to be in the 1950s. It's what we typically call McCarthyism, because Joseph McCarthy, senator from Wisconsin, is going to be kind of one of the key figures. But there are two parts to the Red Scare in the 1950s. You have HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee. That's the House of Representatives side. And then you have Joseph McCarthy and the Senate Intelligence Committee, who are in both the HUAC and McCarthy are going to be investigating communist or suspected communist in high levels of American government and American society. So, for example, McCarthy will argue that he has a list of 200 people at the U.S. State Department who are known communists. He'll go after Hollywood. He'll go after news reporters who try to stop him. He eventually goes after Edward R. Murrow, a very famous and well-known newscaster. And then McCarthy will eventually meet his downfall whenever he attacks the army and claims that there are members of the army that are communist. HUAC will be led by people like Richard Nixon before he's vice president under Eisenhower, and they'll be looking to
Guiding commanding Bill Lester. About living in house, central programming industry to make that peace and service. What is the development to make a house? Just honest with a parts going in your car. Then it has a ideas. Put in that room back. Them share the same at your nurse to bed with it. And I went for all the players on the way. We got to hold all these simple things about with a least rule. One button delivered to the inside. All rum will go two from the house.
While you have a Red Scare and you have a lot of people against or going to jail. You also have what's called the Lavender Scare. People who are LGBT Americans are going to also face a lot of discrimination in the 1950s. They're going to lose their jobs. They're going to be forced into hiding to keep from the hate and discrimination of a country who has so much anxiety about changes and about being different. Okay, I think that's kind of one of the most interesting ironies of this when you think about it, because their whole argument is that communism is a state run by the state that causes everybody to be the same and an individual. But in trying to stop communists, they're highlighting people who are different, and therefore kind of enforcing a type of conformity on American society that they are also arguing against whenever they argue against communism. So just kind of keep that in mind. So when you think of 1950s, think first off about the anxiety that's going to enforce a level of conformity. Conformity will also come from a level of consumerism and affluency that comes out of the post-war world. All right, when World War II ends, a lot of people were scared that the United States would fall back into the Depression, but due to the military-industrial complex and the continued spending of hundreds of millions of dollars on the American military, the U.S. economy will not just keep growing, but it will grow at an exponential rate throughout the 1950s into the early 1960s. And this consumerism is pushed forward by several things. All right. First, after the war, Japan, Germany, other industrialized nations are pretty much in tatters, and the United States' industries are not. You know, the United States is relatively untouched by World War II as far as its infrastructure and its industrial capacity. So the United States emerges from World War II as the world's leading industrial power. Beyond that, you have new credit system being developed. All right, we had credit all throughout the 1920s in the form of store credit, but in the 1950s, you're going to see the development of credit cards. Our first credit card is the Diner's card in 1950, followed by American Express, and then eventually Visa and MasterCard and Discover. But these credit cards are going to allow Americans to purchase newer and newer products. And that's something that American producers learned from the Great Depression, is that there's a need to continuously improve and innovate new materials and new consumer products to keep consumerism growing. And if you can't, then change it just microscopically in order to allow people to buy something new. For example, in the cars, it used to be that Ford would produce the same car over and over and over again. Now, by the 1950s, Ford is producing a different type of the same car every year. So, for example, you may buy a Ford in 1950. By 1952, the Ford's design is different. Therefore, you're going to want to buy a new one. And what this is called is planned obsolescence, right? This idea that you're planning for things to become obsolete. And then the last thing that's really pushing this consumerism is going to be the baby boom. Baby boom will start in 1940s and will continue on to the 1960s. All right, this is the okay boomer generation. All right, and they are going to be one of the biggest growths of the American economy as people are trying to buy houses and consumer products to help take care of their kids. All right, so the baby boom generation will also, because the baby boom generation by the late 50s into the 60s will also become consumers themselves as teenagers, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. All right. Last thing that's causing an economic boom is the American GI Bill. When you talk about the American GI Bill, all right, this is a bill that was intended to help protect and help alleviate the stress of veterans returning from war and going back into the economy. So how do you do that? Well, you try to get more and more veterans who probably missed school because they were fighting the war. You try to get them to go to college. So you're going to provide tuition. The GI Bill will provide tuition, and then you also have these veterans coming home and making babies. Part of the baby boom, you want them to get their own farm or own their own house, and so the Veterans Administration through the GI Bill will also help guarantee loans, which will allow more and more veterans to get homes. Right? We'll see this growth of home ownership in the 1950s. And so this is very important. So you have all of these elements coming from the government, coming from private industry to help promote economic growth, and this causes a huge economic boom in the 1950s. One of the reasons why so many people think of the 1950s as a golden age is because the economy is so prosperous. All right, and this consumerism is going to be a very different kind of consumerism. Yes, you still have the department stores, you still have the mail order catalogs, but you also see the consumerism and the market start to invade the home more and more. So if you think about the market, like you can think of the market yourself. Like right now, you have access to the market. What you're listening to this and what you're watching this recording on, whether it's on your phone or on your laptop or on your iPad, is directly connected to the market. And that market is in your pocket at all times. You're walking around with your friends. You're like, oh, I need this. You can get on Amazon, order it. It'll be there the next day. All right. The market is in your pocket. Well, that is the ultimate result of a trend that starts in the 1920s. All right. In the 1920s, you start getting mail order catalogs. The catalogs come to the people. So the market is coming to the people. You also have the market infiltrating through radio. But by the 1940s and 50s, it's not only the market is infiltrating through mail order catalogs and the radio, but now the market's also infiltrating through the TV, and then you start seeing new business forms show up. So Avon, Mary Kay, Tupperware, they're all going to develop a new business model in which salesmen and housewives will become salesmen in order to sell products to their neighbors and to their friends. And so here you see the market is just completely infiltrating into the American home, all right, through a variety of different means, whether magazines with ads, newspapers with ads, radios with ads, television with ads, Tupperware parties, Avon women coming to your door, Mary Kay saleswomen coming to your door, all right, and the market has now invaded the American home, and this is key to American consumerism, right? Like American consumerism only works if we have complete access to the market pretty much whenever we want, and we can buy whatever we need whenever we want. And that is something that we will see the development over the next 60, 70 years that leads now to the point where your phone is an instant market. You can buy whatever. Oh, you want a movie? Go rent it on, Google Play. Oh, you want to buy some fertilizer? Go to Amazon and buy some fertilizer, right? The market is in your pocket. All right. And it really begins in the 20th century, and that development over time you can see. All right. But while the economy is booming, of course, there are things that are starting to change. This is something that we start seeing in the 1950s, will increase in the 1960s and 70s, and still one thing that we talk about today, and that's automation. American manufacturing was one of the keys to its growth and its economic prosperity in the 1950s. But with that prosperity and with that innovation comes new ways of doing things cheaper. Remember, Taylorism is always And scientific management is always about finding the most efficient way. And so the development of machines and robots that can do the job of these industrial workers is going to create a shift. And what you're going to start seeing in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s is a shift away from manufacturing and towards white-collar jobs and towards management and service industry jobs. And that's something that we have been fighting over the last 20 or 30 years, is how do you bring more manufacturing back to the United States with so much automation. You also see the development of computers in the 1940s and 50s. Now, these are huge. These would take up a room. They were basically massive calculators. But from that and from the massive amount of money that the American government is spending on science research for the space race, for the weapons race, and for the Cold War, scientists and engineers are going to develop faster and better computers. They're going to develop better machines. They're going to develop technologies that are going to completely modernize the United States. All right. Part of this affluence we'll also see, and part of this consumerism we'll also see in the housing market. All right, Americans will start moving out to the suburbs. And when I say Americans, all right, really what I meant was white Americans. White Americans will start moving out to the suburbs in large numbers. Right, Carrollton is a suburb of Dallas that was created in the 1950s and 60s, basically. As a little bedroom community for people who worked in Dallas. All right, and this is going to be huge. And how do you do that? How do you create enough homes for everybody who can buy them now that you have the GI Bill and all this money? Well, the Levitt brothers will develop a system in which they will basically take what Ford was doing with cars, the assembly line, and they did it with homes. You'd have these kit homes that would show up, and they would create these Levitt towns. As you can see, this is a Levitt town right here, right, where all of these homes are basically the same. All right. You know this because you live in a very similar neighborhood probably. If you were to look at your house, look at the floor plan, look at the outside layout, and then travel down your road, your street a little bit. I guarantee you'll find the exact same house, maybe with different brick color or maybe with different stone or different, there's going to be a slight facade difference, but the actual home is probably almost exactly the same as far as layout. And that's what Levitt and the Levitt brothers designed with the Levitt homes. And they would just build them pretty quickly. And that allowed for them to take care of the huge demand on houses in the 1950s.
5 years ago, this was a vast checkerboard of potato farms on New York's Long Island. Today, a community of 60,000 persons living in 15,000 homes, all built by one firm. This is Levittown, one of the most remarkable housing developments ever conceived. The idea that came to a man named Bill Levitt was this: why not apply to the building of houses the same principles that have brought other American industries to their unexcelled peaks of efficiency and service? Why not mass produce the elements that go to make up a house, just as the auto industry does with the parts that go into a new car? Bill Levitt had some other ideas. Put kitchen and bathroom back to back and let them share the same plumbing. Let your plumbers do their work without interruption and without waiting for the carpenter or the bricklayer to get out of the way. Pre-cut your lumber so it's all ready to be assembled into the frame of a house. With the waste removed, one truck can deliver to the building site all the rough lumber that will go into 2 complete Levitt homes. It's really a matter of organization and planning, getting rid of waste motion. When the foundation is ready, coils for the radiant heating are there. Not a day too soon, or a day...
See, mass produce, get rid of the waste movement. These are all scientific management talking points that come out of mass industry like the Ford auto industry and the assembly line. And Levitt used it to build homes, and we still use that same system to build homes, right? It costs a lot to do a custom home. It does not cost as much to build a home the way that most of our suburban communities are built. Now, as Americans moved out to The suburbs, of course, you're going to need more cars, and this is where Ford will jump in. They will figure out a way to capitalize off of this growing affluence and this growing movement into the suburbs.
Fine. Yes, I'd love to. Thanks, Jean. I'll be there. 2 o'clock. Goodbye. You know, 3 weeks ago, I couldn't have accepted that invitation. Like so many people these days, we live in the suburbs, and Dave needs the car every day for business. When he was gone, I was practically a prisoner in my own home. I couldn't get out to see my friends, couldn't take part in PTA activities. I couldn't even shop when I wanted to. I had to wait till Thursday night after Dave brought the car home. But that's all changed now. 3 weeks ago, we bought another Ford, the new low-price custom line Victoria. Isn't it stunning? Dave has it all to himself, and I now have the ranch wagon all to myself. It's a whole new way of life. Now I'm free to go anywhere, do anything, see anybody anytime I want to. It's only good common sense. Why be stuck with one expensive car when you can enjoy all the fun and freedom of 2 fine Fords?
Today, more and more families are finding out.
There's so many things that we could talk about with that commercial. First off, she says she's felt like a prisoner in her own home, and then when she lists out the things that she needed to do, spend time with her friends, go to the PTA, or go shopping, right? It really tells you a lot about gender roles that we'll talk a little bit about later, and how women were seen as far as what their roles in society really were. All right, but now you can see Ford is capitalizing on it. You bought one Ford. Oh yes, no, now you got to buy 2 Fords, right? Be a 2 Ford family. All right, and that was a huge push in the 1950s, again, to push that consumerism further. All right, now we can talk all about this, but we understand that as Americans moved to the suburbs, this left a serious situation behind in the cities, and the GI Bill. The Levitt towns, they were all intended for white families. In fact, there were rules and laws and procedures put in place that would stop African American families from actually benefiting from these things. So even the GI Bill, which said that, which did not make a differentiation between black and white soldiers and veterans, really did not apply to black veterans. All right, and you have the cities who are left behind. Think about it, you have a massive amount of capital and wealth that are moving out of the cities into the suburbs. You'll have industries and businesses that will move out of the cities into the suburbs. And so by the 1960s, these cities are really suffering from basically many depressions. And you have these horrible economic conditions in the cities because banks won't give African American families loans. Cities won't develop African American communities and African American housing, and so you have these horrific living conditions in the cities that are going to create slum conditions in the cities. Sorry, let me try to take care of these things so the pop-ups don't keep coming up. All right, boom, there we go. And so here's an example of a slum condition in Dallas, Texas in 1950. This is the Mill Creek slum. All right. And of course, if you're living in this area, you're going to want to try to get out. All right. And that's going to be something that a lot of African American families want to do. They want to leave as well. They want to get out of the slum conditions and get to the suburbs. But those conditions will not be applicable to African American families. Part of this process that we know of as white flight, as white Americans move out of the cities, is that they develop these communities and these neighborhoods in which they were white only, and black families were not welcomed. All right, and in fact, so much so that if a black family attempted to buy a house in a white neighborhood, they would be met with violence and threats. For example, this picture is from Dallas again, and these police officers are checking out the damage on a home in a white neighborhood that was bought by a black family. All right, and there would be laws and rules put in place and things of that nature to stop black families from buying these white homes. There's a great book called White Flight. Here's a picture of it right here by Kevin Cruz, and it's a discussion about this kind of development of white Americans moving out of the cities and creating white-only neighborhoods. and and they go through several different ways of doing this. I mean, eventually the development of homeowner associations were an offshoot of this, as they tried to keep certain peoples from buying in certain neighborhoods. Okay, and so understand that all this affluence, while everybody tends to see their standard of living going up, the difference between a white family and a black family is huge by the 1950s as far as the standard of living, and a lot of this post-war affluence is really being taken by white families and by white Americans, and black Americans are being left out. All right. One way that we see the growth of consumerism, but also the growth of conformity, is through the creation of the TV. All right. Now, TV becomes a popular form of media starting in the late 1940s, and throughout the 1950s, millions of Americans will buy TVs, so that by the end of the 1950s, almost 85% of American homes own at least one television. All right, and you have amazing shows that are created, shows like The Honeymooners or I Love Lucy. All right, but most of the shows will tend to try to show a level of middle class white morality. For example, Father Knows Best, or The Donna Reed Show, or Leave It to Beaver. Right, when you look at these pictures, I mean, I would dare say you can't really tell a difference between these three families in any real sense, but that was it. You know, you have the dad who worked, you have the mom who stayed home, you have the kids who obeyed their parents, maybe got into a few hijinks, but tended to, go to school and learn lessons from their parents. And this was a way that American television really tried to push these middle class morals onto society. And then you create this kind of dichotomy. For example, on one hand, you'd have these middle class suburban families, or in this case, a middle class urban family. And the morality that's there, you notice that there's 2 beds in the middle class family. All right, even though she's pregnant right here. All right. On the other side, television would also, so you have television pushing this middle class morality, but if they wanted to find some humor in the working class, they always found it in very stereotypical ways, like The Honeymooners, he's a bus driver, or you can even bring it up to the more modern sense. If you watch Roseanne, or if you watch The Simpsons or something like that, they would find ways in which the working class was funny because they're working class and because they're not as middle class or moral as others, right? So television will create this, and part of what television is doing here is they're creating a national culture. So if you're watching The Honeymooners in New York, you're probably also watching The Honeymooners in San Francisco, and now all of a sudden you have a more unified national culture. Okay, these are iconic 1950s shows that people all around the country were watching. Okay, and people all around the country knew these shows. Very similar to what you see today with The Bachelor or any of the Netflix shows. Right, Netflix is ubiquitous. Pretty much everybody has a Netflix account, and you watch Netflix shows. Right, that's exactly the same here. That this kind of national media helps create cultural moments and cultural connectivity. All right, and of course, television brings that consumerism into the house, and you know this because you watch American television. American television, very simple. You start with a commercial, then you get about a third of the show, then you get some more commercials, then you get another part of the show, then you get some more commercials, then you get the end of the show, and then there are some more commercials after that. American television, very similar to American magazines, American newspapers, American radio, is all centered around advertisements and getting people to watch so that they can get ad money, because that's how they make money. We don't have state-run media the way that other countries do. Instead, our media is all privatized, which means that they have to have commercials that support them, which means that you will see commercials and product placement throughout American media.
They sure work hard, don't they, Barney? Yeah? I hate to see them work so hard. Yeah, me too. Let's go around back where we can't see them. Gee, we ought to do something, Fred. Okay. How's about taking a nap? Hey, I got a better idea. Let's take a Winston break. That's it. Winston counts. Here, ahead of the pure white filter. Winston packs rich tobaccos specially selected and specially processed for good flavor in filter smoking.
Yeah, Barney, Winston tastes good, like a cigarette should.
So the Flintstones is a kids cartoon, and then here they were selling cigarettes. So, and that's just one of many examples that you could pull out there of consumerism during this time period. Now, other elements of 1950s culture is, of course, the growth of the car culture. Cars have been part of American culture since the 1920s with the Fords, but in 1950s, the United States will grow the interstate highway. You see here, Eisenhower is going to sign the Federal Highway Act of 1956, which will create the interstate highway system and will expand the interstate highway system. And they'll do it within, in coordination with the Department of Defense, so that you'd have these kind of defensive roads that you could also use. And so, with the growth of the interstate highway system, cars and the American road trip will be an immensely important part of American culture. All right, as Americans will get into their big cars and they'll drive around. They'll go to Disneyland, which is created in the 1950s. They'll stay at motels, motor hotels. They'll stay at these Holiday Inn will grow in the 1950s and 60s. They'll go to drive-in movies, and then you have the growth of the fast food restaurant. Right, these all become part of American culture, and all of a sudden America becomes almost like placeless, because anywhere you go, you're going to see the same basic businesses, right? Like anywhere I go in the United States, I can find a McDonald's. Okay, anywhere I go in the United States. McDonald's is also a great example of how that scientific management that we've been talking about for so long is being applied to different industries. So like the housing industry applies it with Levittowns and the growth of those kit homes. And then the McDonald's is a perfect example of scientific management in the fast food industry. All right, as they take the elements that goes into creating a burger and fries, and they make it so efficient that they can do it really quickly and for cheap, right? And they are going to corner the fast food market for a long time. All right, even now, as Americans are on their health kick, McDonald's is still doing relatively well. All right, and so this is huge, right? This is the culture of the car, and making American culture pretty much homogenous, right? As you start seeing fewer and fewer distinct local identities and much more of a national identity developing. Okay, now with all of this comes very different gender roles than what we'd seen before. Okay, if you think about it, women in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, early 40s, were very independent, and that independence was growing, right? Because you have Margaret Sanger and the birth control movement. You had in the 1920s, you had the flappers in the 1920s. You have more and more jobs and educational opportunities in the 1920s, and then by the 30s, you have women who are working and who are supporting families. And in the 1940s, they're taking over industry during World War II, and so you have this kind of growth of women's, roles and prominence in American society, as well as their independence through both economic and sexual means. But in the 1950s, that's going to all be suppressed again. All right, we talked a little bit about this before, the idea that even as Rosie the Riveter was encouraging women to go to industries, all right, they were also creating pamphlets saying, don't get used to it, you're going back home afterwards. And so middle class morality in the 1950s is going to redevelop the cult of domesticity, right? And this push for women to become American housewives. And you see that here's a home ec book. Have dinner ready, plan ahead, even the night before, to have a delicious meal on time. This is a way of letting him, the husband, know that you have been thinking of him and are concerned for his needs. Most men are hungry when they come home, and the prospects of a good meal are part of the warm welcome needed. And so this becomes a part of the American women's experience during the 1950s, but will also end up leading the United States into a second wave of feminism as women start to demand more rights and more freedoms out of this cult of domesticity. Okay. The other part to this is not just women being forced into the home as the cult of domesticity grows, but it's also men having to conform to white collar, bureaucracies and trying to fit in within the institution. The best example of this, if you've watched The Incredibles, is just watch the dad in The Incredibles as he's trying to become an insurance guy, right? After he can no longer be a superhero and he's having to conform to the institution. That's probably the best example I can give you of this 1950s men's gender role as well, right? Remember, gender roles go for both men and women. So when we talk about genderism and sexism, stuff like that, really it's about restricting the freedom of expression of both men and women.
Denied? You're denying my claim? Oh, I don't understand. I have full coverage.
I'm sorry, Mrs. Hoganson, but our liability is spelled out in paragraph 17. It states
I
clearly.
can't pay for this.
Excuse me. Claims, Bob Parr.
I'm calling to celebrate a momentous occasion. We are now officially moved in.
Yeah, well, that's great, honey. And the last 3 years don't count because
I finally unpacked the last box. Now it's official. Ha ha ha. Why do we have so much junk?
Listen, honey, I've got a client.
Say no more. Go save the world one policy at a time, honey. Oh, I gotta go pick up the kids from school. See you tonight.
Bye, honey. Excuse me. Where were we?
I'm on a fixed income. And if you can't help me, I don't know what I'll do.
All right, listen closely. I'd like to help you, but I can't. I'd like to tell you to take a copy of your policy to Norma Wilcox on Norma Wilcox, Wilcox, on the 3rd floor, but I can't. I also do not advise you to fill out and file a WS-2475 form with our legal department on the 2nd floor. I would not expect someone to get back to you quickly to resolve the matter. I'd like to help, but there's nothing I can do.
Oh, thank you, man.
I'm sorry, ma'am. I know you're upset. Pretend to be upset.
You authorized payment on the Walker policy?
Someone broke into their house, Mr. Huff. Their policy clearly covers them
I
against
don't want to know about their coverage, Bob. Don't tell me about their coverage. Tell me how you're keeping Insuracare in the black. Tell me how that's possible with you writing checks to every Harry Hardluck and Sally sob story that gives you a phone call.
All right. So you have the conformity, you have the affluence, you have the car culture, you have the movement to the suburbs. Part of that movement to the suburbs is also the movement to the Sun Belt, which is the South. You see more and more industries growing up in the South, especially military, industrial industries, right? But beyond that, you also have the growth of Christianity. You have another wave of Christianity growing in the United States, more religious conviction for a lot of Americans, and a lot of this comes out of fear of atomic annihilation. A lot of it comes out of fear of the communist atheistic state, right? If you think about when we put in God we trust or under God into our Pledge of Allegiance and onto our money, really it comes back to this idea that you're trying to differentiate yourself in the Cold War as a religious state, the United States, versus an atheistic state in the Soviet Union. And this will lead us to some of the biggest movies of the time period, the Ten Commandments or Ben-Hur. It will also lead us to televangelists, right? So with the growth of television, you have the growth of televangelists, these preachers who would go on TV and they would preach their message to a larger mass audience, people like Billy Graham, who would be pushing kind of a Christian revivalism into the 1950s. Okay. Now, with all that being said, there was a lot of undercurrent of angst and a lot of undercurrent of rebellion within the United States, right? So you have this kind of veneer of conformity and people wanting to, fit in, but beyond that, you have a rising teen culture, you have a rising literary movement who are all critical and very upset by the conformity and consumerism that they find in the United States. For example, you have rock and roll. Rock and roll becomes a massive a popular music scene for the American public, all right, especially for the teens. Teens become a huge market for the music industry and for popular music, and with Elvis being kind of the lead of that, but there's a lot of others as well. Here's a newspaper article from the 1950s about a man who was so upset that his that his daughter would ever want to go see Elvis Presley because all he did was shake a leg, right? When he shook one pant leg, they screamed like jets, these fresh-faced girls with Pleasant Wheatland City. When he shook both pant legs, they screamed and quivered and shut their eyes. It's a really disturbing article, but understand that what he's doing is he's upset because this music, oh my goodness, this music, this rock and roll is causing his girls to be less moral. All right, and that is a trend that you see, right? Like whether it's rock and roll in the 1950s or it's going to be hip hop in the 1980s and 90s, right? Death, or heavy metal in the 1990s and early O's, or you can think of anything like what is it that or electronic dance music in the 2000s. What is it that adults really don't understand that kids love to listen to, right? And that's what you see here. So you see the first real signs of a teen culture in the 1950s. Okay, and this is going to really upset a lot. I'll let you go and watch Elvis Presley on your own. All right, but this teen culture of rebellion against the man is going to grow. You also have the foundations of a sexual revolution. All right, Dr. Alfred Kinsey was a biologist who will study the habits of the American sex life, and he'll publish a couple of reports about it, and it's going to shock Americans. We're basically, sex is not something that you're supposed to talk about, but here Alfred Kinsey is saying, yes, everybody does it, and it's natural. You also have the creation in the 1950s of Playboy by Hugh Hefner, who basically say, have fun and live your life. In the 1960s, Margaret Sanger and Planned Parenthood will create a commercial form of the pill, and so this will lead us into the sexual revolution in the 1960s. Okay, and then you have a literary movement. The Beats will come of age in the 1950s, people like Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg, and they will, very similar to the Lost Generation in the 1920s or the Transcendentalists in the antebellum period, they will mourn the loss of American, ingenuity or American individualism. They'll mourn the loss of humanity to consumerism. All right, and they will discuss, this issue of this hatred of consumerism, and they will start pushing towards like experimenting with drugs and trying to find new ways of dealing with the modern world. All right, well, that doesn't work. All right, so that's the 1950s in a nutshell. Pretty quick and fabulous. This is the 1950s that you have both conformity and conservatism and anxiety going on with the Cold War and the atomic weaponry, but you also have a growing teen culture and a growing rebellion against that consumerism that's going to lead us into the 1960s, and we'll see all of that come to a head when these baby boomers go into college in the 1960s and they start demanding rights and changes to American society. It's going to be one of those ultimate downers here. The baby boom generation is the generation of the civil rights movement and the movement and the protest for free speech, and then they will turn into what we have to deal with today. Ha ha ha. Anyways, all right, if you have any questions, please talk to me, email me. If I'm on WebEx, you can always request a meeting face-to-face, and we can have a little chat about it. Make sure you ask me any questions. Your next assignment will be to deal with some document analysis. All right, let me know. Thank you. Bye.